I've stood outside that gate for 22 years. Rain, snow, coronation crowds, the lot. And in all that time I saw a royal guard break formation exactly once. It took 9 seconds. I counted them. I don't know why I counted. Your brain does strange things when it knows it's watching something it shouldn't be seeing. My name's Wilf Brannan. I sell flowers from a cart on the corner of Marley Row and Kingsgate Approach, right where the tourists come round the bend and see the palace for the first time and all say the same word. Doesn't matter what language they speak. It's always the same little breath out. Oh. I've heard it maybe 2 million times. Still gets me a bit. But I'm not telling you about the palace. I'm telling you about a 9-year-old girl, a sergeant with a scar through one eyebrow, and a thing her mother taught her that nobody else in the world was supposed to know. Stay with me, it's worth it. It was the 3rd Saturday in April. I remember because I just switched the cart over to tulips and the tulips were behaving badly. They'd opened too fast in the van, all of them yawning wide by 9 in the morning, no good to anybody. Tulips are like that, impatient flowers. The weather was that particular Tarnwick spring weather where the sky can't commit. Bright 1 minute, then a cloud comes over and you're cold in your shirt. Wind coming up the approach in gusts, lifting people's hats, making the flags on the palace roof snap and go slack, snap and go slack. The crowd was big. Bigger than a normal Saturday. There were 3 reasons for that, and I knew all 3, because standing on a corner for 22 years means you know everything before the papers do. Reason 1, the weather held, people come out. Reason 2, the school holidays had started, so there were children everywhere, on shoulders, in prams, running at the pigeons like the pigeons were going to be surprised about it. And reason 3, the real reason, was Princess Wren. You have to understand what she was to us. Queen Adela died 3 years before that morning. Not dramatically. That's the thing nobody outside Tarnwick ever gets right when they tell it. There was no scandal, no long lingering thing. She was ill for 8 months. And then she wasn't with us anymore, and the whole country went quiet in a way I've never felt before or since. I closed the cart for 4 days, couldn't sell flowers. It felt obscene. Then on the 5th day I opened it again and gave everything away for free, every stem, because people kept coming to the gate to leave them and they had nowhere to buy any. Cost me 1,100 crowns, best money I ever spent. Adela had been queen since she was 26. She was 51 when she went, and Wren was 6. 6 years old, standing at the front of that funeral procession in a gray coat with her hands folded. And I watched from the pavement and I thought, that child does not know what has happened to her yet, and one day she will, and God help her when it comes. After that they kept her out of sight, not cruelly, protectively. Her father, Prince Consort Aldous, decent man, quiet man, never wanted the job of being anybody's public figure. He pulled the shutters down. She went to a normalish school. She was photographed maybe 6 times in 3 years and each time from about half a mile away with a lens the size of a drainpipe. So the palace announcing that Princess Wren would walk the Kingsgate line on the 3rd Saturday in April, greet the crowd, take flowers, do a lap of the railings, that was enormous. First proper public appearance since her mother's funeral. 9 years old. People had come from everywhere. I'd sold out of tulips by 9:30, which never happens. Sold the roses. Sold the horrible carnations I'd been trying to move since Thursday. By 10, I was down to a bucket of white freesias I'd been saving for a wedding order, and I sold those too, and I'm not proud of it. The crowd along the railings was 6 deep by then. 6 deep all the way from the corner where I stand to the Ambassador's Arch, which is, call it 400 yards, pressed in, phones up, little flags. That low sound a big crowd makes, which isn't talking exactly, it's more like a kettle just before it goes. And the guard were out. Now, if you've never seen the Kingsgate Guard, I need to explain something, because the tourists get it wrong constantly, and it drives me spare. People think they're statues. People think it's a costume thing, a photo thing, a lad standing still for the cameras. Tourists lean in and pull faces at them, sing at them. One time a fellow from I won't say where brought a live chicken. Actual chicken. Held it up to a guardsman's face for a photograph. The guardsman didn't move, not an eyelash. Chickens flapping, tourists screaming, laughing, and this young man in a red tunic stared through it all like the whole thing was happening on another planet. That's not a statue, that's discipline. There's a difference, and the difference is everything. Those men and women are soldiers. Half of them have been places you couldn't find on a map and wouldn't want to. The stillness isn't for you. The stillness is a promise. It says, whatever happens, I will be exactly where I said I would be. And breaking formation, leaving your post, stepping off the line without an order, that's not naughty. That's not a telling off and a laugh in the mess. That is the end of your career and possibly the start of a court-martial, and every single one of them knows it from day one. 9 seconds, remember that, we'll come back to it. There were 8 of them on the outer line that morning, standard for a walkabout. And on the near end, the end closest to my corner, was Sergeant Emlyn Roach. I knew Roach, not knew him. He'd never so much as looked at me on duty. But he'd come past the cart in civvies maybe a dozen times over the years, bought a small bunch of something, always paid exact change, always said, "Thanks, Wilf," in a voice like gravel in a tin. Big man, 50-something, gray at the temples where the cap didn't hide it, and a scar that started at the outside of his left eyebrow and went up into his hairline, thin white line, old. I asked him about it once years back, being nosy, and he said, "Fell off a wall," and that was that. He'd been on that gate longer than I'd been on my corner, which is saying something. There was a thing about Roach that everybody on the street knew and nobody could prove. The story went that he'd been Queen Adela's personal detail when she was young, before she was queen. Back when she was just a nervous princess in her 20s and he was a nervous corporal in his 20s, and the two of them had done about 400 of these walkabouts together. I don't know if it was true. Street stories are half rubbish. Turned out this one wasn't. She came out at 10 past 11. I heard it before I saw it. The sound of a big crowd changing pitch is one of the great sounds of the world. It goes from kettle to something higher, brighter. Thousands of people all inhaling at once. I climbed onto the crossbar of my cart, wobbled, grabbed the awning pole. Old man clinging to a flower cart like a monkey. That was your correspondent's view of the historic day. But I saw her. She was smaller than I expected. That's the thing about the telly, it makes everyone the same size. She was in a pale blue coat, buttoned all the way up even though it wasn't that cold, and she had her hair back in a plait, and she was walking about a step and a half behind her father with her hands doing that thing that nervous children's hands do, one gripping the other, like she was stopping herself from floating away. Her father put his hand on the back of her neck, just briefly, and she looked up at him and did a smile. I've been selling flowers to human beings since I was 19. I know a real smile, and I know the other kind. That was the other kind. That was a smile she'd practiced. And then the crowd absolutely roared, and the little girl in the blue coat flinched, properly flinched, whole body, like someone had clapped by her ear. And then she got it back, and she straightened up, and she walked to the railings. Nobody else saw the flinch. I'd bet my cart on it. Everyone was too busy shouting her name. Roach saw it. I know he saw it because I was watching Roach at that exact second, and something happened in his face. Nothing you'd photograph, just the smallest tightening around the eyes. A man clenching his jaw with his jaw shut, if that makes sense. Then it was gone, and he was stone again. The first 10 minutes were lovely, genuinely. She was good at it, better than good. She went along the railings taking flowers off people, and she'd say something to each one, and you could see the little conversations happening. A woman handing her a bouquet nearly the size of the child herself, and Wren staggering theatrically under the weight of it, and the woman laughing, and Wren laughing, and that one was real. She'd hand each bunch back to an aide who was walking behind her with a wicker basket, and the basket filled up in about 90 seconds, and then a second aide appeared with a second basket, and by minute 4, there was a small procession of adults carrying flowers behind a 9-year-old like she was a queen ant. There was a boy in a wheelchair near the arch, and she stopped there for a good 2 minutes, crouched right down to his level. Whatever he said made her put her hand over her mouth. The crowd loved her. You could feel it come off the pavement like heat. And I remember this so clearly, I remember thinking, she's all right. She's going to be all right. Adela did a good job before she went. That was 11:22. At 11:26, everything came apart. They'd been doing work on the ambassador's arch since February. Stonework, some kind of restoration. The facing on the west pillar had come loose in the winter storms, and they'd put scaffolding up the whole side of it, 3 stories, with those green mesh sheets over the front. It had been there so long it had stopped being scaffolding and started being furniture. you forget it's there. They'd sheeted it for the walkabout, made it look tidy, put a hoarding round the base with a painting of what the arch was going to look like when it was finished, all clean and golden, with a fake blue sky behind it. And a gust came up the approach. I felt it before I understood it. That April wind that had been playing all morning, lifting hats, flicking the flags. It came round the corner of Marley Row in one long shove, and it got underneath that green mesh sheeting. The sheet filled like a sail. There was maybe a second and a half where you could see it happening and not do anything about it. The whole face of that scaffold bellied out, 3 stories of it, the mesh going tight and round like a lung, and I heard the metal start to complain, this high, thin, cree-y, and I opened my mouth to shout something, and I have no idea what I was going to shout. Then the top 2 lifts of it went. I want to be careful here, because I've heard people describe this since, and they make it sound like a film. It wasn't a film. It was much worse and much stupider than a film. It didn't explode. It fell. 40 feet of steel tube and boards came off the front of that pillar and hit the pavement and the hoarding and the road and the noise. I need you to understand the noise. It was one sound, not a rattle, not a clatter. All of it landed inside about 1/3 of a second, and it made one enormous flat bang that came up the approach and hit us in the chest. I felt it in my teeth. I felt it in the flour cart under my hands. And 4,000 people had exactly the same thought at exactly the same moment, and I know they did because I had it too, and I'm ashamed of it and I'd have it again. Bombed. That's what your brain says. That's what everybody's brain said. There'd been a scare at the Northgate station 8 months before. Nothing came of it, but it was in everyone's bones. So 4,000 people heard a flat bang near a royal walkabout, and every single one of them thought the same word. And then 4,000 people all moved at once. You cannot imagine it. You think you can. You've seen crowds on the news. You think people ran. People didn't run. There was nowhere to run. 6 deep against iron railings on one side, buildings on the other, and a bottleneck at Marley Row that was about 11 feet wide. The back of the crowd went away from the arch. The front of the crowd, the ones pressed against the railings, couldn't go anywhere at all. So the pressure went sideways. I watched a wave move through 4,000 human beings, an actual wave. You could see it traveling, this ripple of bodies going down the line, and where it went people came off their feet. Not fell. Came off their feet lifted, like the ground had stopped being involved. Someone's pram went over. I saw it go, and I saw a man in a yellow jacket get to it in about 1.5 seconds. And I have thought about that man every week since, and I hope he knows what he did. My cart went down. 200 crowns of bucket and awning, and the whole thing folded, and I went down with it and cracked my knee on the curb, and I didn't feel that for about 4 hours. And I got up on my elbows in the road, with a bucket rolling away from me, and I looked up the approach towards the railings. And I found her. She was on her own. That's the bit that still wakes me up. The detail had gone forward. That's what they're trained to do. They'd all surge toward the arch, toward the noise, toward the thing, because that's the job. You go at it. You don't go away from it. 2 of them had her father. I could see Aldous being physically carried, feet barely touching, back toward the gate, and he was fighting them, shouting, twisting round, and I could hear him even over everything else, one word over and over. And the crowd had come off the railings and surged and closed, and somewhere in those 2 seconds, Princess Wren had been put behind the wrong side of the wave. She was maybe 30 feet from the gate. She might as well have been in another country. She was standing in about 4 square feet of space that people were losing by the second. Adults everywhere, waists and elbows and bags at the exact height of her face. A woman fell against her and Wren staggered and stayed up somehow. Someone stood on her coat. And she was doing something I'll never forget. She wasn't screaming. Every other person in that crowd was making noise, and the Princess of Tarnwick was silent. Just standing there in her blue coat with her chin up, turning her head, looking for someone. Very fast, left, right, left. That's all. 9 years old, and she'd gone completely, terribly quiet. I've thought about why since. I think, and I could be wrong, I think you don't get to be Queen Adela's daughter without learning, somewhere deep down, that you don't scream in front of people. I think she'd been taught that so early she didn't know it was a lesson. So she didn't scream. She did something else instead. She stopped turning her head. She went still. In the middle of all that, this little girl went absolutely still, and she took her right hand. And this is the part I've told maybe 4 people in 3 years because it sounds like nothing, and it was everything. She laid her right hand flat against her own collarbone. Flat, palm down, fingers spread, pressed it there over the top button of that blue coat and held it. Didn't wave, didn't reach out, just held her hand on her own chest like she was keeping something in. And I remember lying there in the road with my knee opening up and thinking, quite clearly, quite stupidly, "What are you doing, love? What is that?" Because it looked like nothing. It looked like a frightened child clutching herself. That's what it looked like to 4,000 people, and it's what it looked like to me. It was not nothing. It was a message. It was a message sent by a woman who had been dead for 3 years, and it went over the heads of that entire screaming crowd to exactly one person. I turned my head. Down the line at the near end of the outer formation, in the middle of a world coming to pieces, 7 guards had turned toward the arch and dropped their stance, and were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. And Sergeant Emlyn Roach hadn't moved at all. He was still at his post, still facing front. 50-something years old, scar through his eyebrow, absolutely rigid, doing the thing he had done 10,000 times on that pavement. Except he was looking at her. Not with his head hadn't moved a degree. His eyes had gone all the way to the left, right to the corner, so far you could see the white of them, and they were locked on a small girl in a blue coat with her hand flat on her chest. And I watched Sergeant Roach's face come apart. Just for a moment, just for a piece of a second. This enormous stone of a man, and something went through him like a crack through ice from the eyebrow down. I saw his throat move. And then he broke formation. 9 seconds. I counted them, and I didn't know I was counting them until later, when I was sitting on a curb with a blanket round me and a paramedic asking my name, and I realized I'd been saying numbers under my breath. 9 seconds from the moment Sergeant Emlyn Roach stepped off that line to the moment he came out of the crowd on the other side. I'm going to tell you what happened in those 9 seconds, and then I'm going to tell you what happened afterwards in a room in the palace when they sat him down and asked him the one question nobody could answer. How did you know? Because that signal wasn't in any briefing. It wasn't in any protocol document. It wasn't taught, written down, or spoken aloud in 30 years. Queen Adela had given it to exactly 2 people in her whole life. One of them was her daughter. The other one was standing on a gate on Kingsgate Approach with a rifle on his shoulder and his heart in his mouth. 9 seconds. I've had 3 years to think about 9 seconds, and I still can't make them fit in my head properly. They keep spilling over the edges. Here's what I mean. If I asked you to describe 9 seconds of your life, you'd struggle. 9 seconds is nothing. It's the time it takes to tie a shoelace badly. It's a lift between 2 floors. But I can tell you every single thing that happened in those 9, in order, like reading a list. And I was flat on my back in the road with a bucket of water soaking into my trousers. That's what fear does to time. It doesn't slow it down. That's the wrong way of putting it. It just makes you greedy. Your brain grabs everything. So here they are. 1. Roach stepped off the line. I want you to understand what that looked like because it didn't look dramatic. It looked wrong. That's the only word. Like watching a lamppost take a step. Your eye has seen that man in that position for years. He is part of the architecture. And then the architecture moved and my whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the scaffold or the bang. He didn't run. First thing he did was turn a quarter turn and drop his rifle off his shoulder into his hands, across his chest, held horizontal like a bar, like a gate. And I thought, oh God, he's going to. He didn't. He never touched anyone with it, not once, not for a second. I need that on record because of what people said afterwards. 2. He went into the crowd. Not through a gap. There were no gaps. He went into a solid wall of panicking human beings sideways, shoulder first, with that rifle held crossways in front of him, and he used it exactly the way you'd use your forearm to get through a door that's swinging shut. And here's the thing that people don't get about a man that size in a bearskin cap. He was suddenly 7.5 feet tall. That cap makes them absurd when they're standing still. It's a joke. It's a postcard. But when the world's gone to pieces and everyone's at eye level with everyone else's shoulders, and this enormous column of black fur and red starts driving through the middle of it. People saw it coming. I watched the crowd part for him, not politely. They didn't want to, but there's something hardwired in us, something older than sense, and 4,000 terrified people looked up and saw a soldier coming, and something in the back of their brains went, "Move." 3. He shouted. First time in 22 years, I heard a Kingsgate guard use his voice on that pavement. I couldn't tell you the words. I've tried. It wasn't words exactly. It was that noise sergeants make that comes from somewhere under the ribs, a flat bark that cuts through 4,000 screams like a knife through a curtain. And people shut up. A pocket of maybe 40 people around him just stopped screaming. In the middle of everything. Because someone in a uniform had made a noise like he knew what he was doing, and that's all a panicking human wants in the world. 4. Halfway. He was halfway and he'd lost his cap. Someone's elbow, someone's bag, I don't know. It came off and it went down into the crowd and was gone, and there was Sergeant Emlyn Roach with his gray hair sticking up, and his scar white in the light, and a look on his face I hope I never see again. Because up to that point, he'd been a soldier doing a soldier thing. That face wasn't a soldier's face. 5. A man went for him. I'll be fair to that man. He was terrified. He had a child on his shoulders, and he was trying to get to Marley Row, and Roach was in his way, and he put a hand out and shoved at Roach's chest with the flat of it. Roach didn't break stride. He didn't look at him. He took the shove, turned his shoulder through it, and put his free hand up under the child on the man's shoulders, just steadied the kid 1 second so the shove wouldn't tip him, and then he was past. I saw that. I'd swear to it in any court in the land. In the middle of the worst thing that ever happened on that street, going full tilt toward a child he'd never spoken to. He stopped for half a heartbeat to keep a stranger's toddler from falling off his dad. 6. She saw him. That 6, she saw him coming. She was still standing there with her hand flat on her chest, and the world closing on her from every side, and she looked up, and her face. I've sold flowers to people at every moment of their lives. Weddings, funerals, apologies, hospitals. I have seen every face a person's got. I have never seen a face like that, not before, not since. It wasn't relief. Relief is soft, this was. She broke. Everything she'd been holding in that little body, all that silence, all that chin-up, all of it went, all at once, and her mouth came open, and for the first time in the whole thing Princess Wren of Tarnwick screamed. One word. I didn't hear it, too much noise, too far. But I saw her mouth make it, and it was one syllable, and I've turned it over 10,000 times since. And I think she didn't shout for her father. I think she shouted a name. 7. He got there. 8. And here is the thing that broke my heart in half, and put it back together wrong. He didn't pick her up. Every single person who wasn't there tells this story with him sweeping her up in his arms. Every version. It's in the papers, it's in the songs. There's a bloody statue now with him carrying her. He didn't. What he did was drop. 50-something years old in full dress in a crowd stampeding round him, he went straight down onto one knee, hard, so hard I heard it, and he put himself in front of her. Just his back. This enormous red back between her and the whole world, and his arms out either side, braced, holding a gap open with his own body. He made her a room. That's what it was. 4 square feet of nothing in the middle of everything, and he built it out of himself. And then, only then, he turned his head and looked at her. 9. She put her arms round his neck. And that's when he stood up, with her already holding on, not him grabbing her choosing. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole story. He came up out of that crowd with a 9-year-old on his chest and her face in his collar and her hands locked behind his neck. And he turned toward the gate, and he started walking. 9 seconds. Now, you want to know about the signal. Everyone wants to know about the signal. That's what made it a story instead of an incident. If it had just been a brave man and a scared girl, it'd have been in the papers for 2 days and gone. It was the hand that did it, because someone had filmed it. Of course someone had filmed it, 4,000 phones. There were 19 angles of that walkabout by tea time, and one of them, a woman from Ostravik on holiday standing on a bin, One of them caught the whole thing clean. And on that footage, at 11:26 and 41 seconds, you can see a small girl in a blue coat put her hand flat on her chest. And at 11:26 and 43 seconds, 2 seconds later, 300 feet away, through 4,000 people, a man steps off a line he has not stepped off in 30 years. 2 seconds. You can't explain that. That's what got people. That's what put it round the world in a night. He couldn't have seen her face. He couldn't have heard her. She never called out. There was no radio. Dress guards on the outer line don't carry them. Nobody gave an order. The order that eventually came 40 seconds later, and it was hold the line, which he was already disobeying. He looked at a hand on a chest, and he went. They asked him. Obviously, they asked him. 3 days later, in a room in the palace with a long table and 4 people on the other side of it and a colonel at the middle, they asked Sergeant Emlyn Roach the only question that mattered. "Sergeant, how did you know?" And he said nothing. Sat there, hands on his knees, 20 minutes. Because the answer wasn't his to give. I got the rest of it later. Bits from a woman who cleans that wing. Bits from a lad in the guard who used to buy lilies off me for his mum. Bits from the thing that got published 2 years after when it stopped being secret. But mostly I got it from Roach himself, on a Tuesday at my cart, with a small bunch of freesias in his hand and the whole street pretending not to look at him. So this next part, I'm telling you what he told me. Take it how you like. It starts in 1994. Adela was 26, not queen, nowhere near queen. Her mother was on the throne and looked good for another 20 years, and Adela was third in line and, by every account I've ever heard, absolutely terrified of everything. That's not in the books. The books say poised. The books say dignified from a young age. Roach said she used to be sick before walkabouts. Actually sick, in a lavatory with a lady-in-waiting holding her hair, and then she'd rinse her mouth and put her lipstick on and walk out and smile at 40,000 people. He said it took him a year to work out she was doing it. She hit it that well. And Emlyn Roach was 24 years old and 2 months into personal detail, and he was, in his words, no use to anybody. Nervous. Green kept standing in the wrong place. He said the first 4 months he was so frightened of getting it wrong that he barely looked at her. You're not meant to look. That's half the training. You look at everyone else. And so for 4 months he guarded a woman he'd never properly seen. Then came Portsmouth. Portsmouth, September 94. Big crowd, hot day, some sort of anniversary of something, and Adela was doing the line. And a man got through. Not a bad man, as it turned out. That's what nobody remembers. He was ill. He was very ill, and he'd stopped taking things he was meant to take, and he'd got it into his head that Adela was sending him messages through the television, and he came over the barrier with a rolled-up newspaper in his fist and about 11 feet to cover. They had him in 4 seconds. Roach wasn't even the one who got him. A fellow called Peck did. Took him down clean, no fuss, whole thing was over before most of the crowd noticed. 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, Roach said he did the correct thing. Textbook. He moved to the princess and he put a hand on her arm and he said the words you're trained to say, which are "ma'am" with me this way now. And Adela didn't move. He said she'd gone rigid, absolutely locked. 26 years old, standing in the sun with a bouquet in her hands, and her eyes had gone somewhere else entirely. He said, and he said this bit slowly at my cart, looking at the freesias and not at me, he said, I was pulling at her, Wilf. I had hold of her arm and I was pulling and she wasn't there. And I thought she'd been hurt. I thought the newspaper had something in it and I hadn't seen, and she was standing there bleeding and I'd missed it. She hadn't been hurt. She just couldn't move. Peck's got the man down, the crowd's going up. There's 100 cameras, and the third in line to the throne of Tarnwick is frozen solid in the middle of it. And in about 4 more seconds, every photographer in that press pen is going to turn round and see it. And a 24-year-old corporal with no idea what he was doing let go of her arm. That's what he said, he let go. And instead he stepped in front of her, just stood there, broad in the shoulder even then, back to her, facing the crowd, hands behind him, and he said, quietly, not turning round, Take your time, ma'am. That's all. Take your time, ma'am. And he stood there and he blocked her from the world for 11 seconds until he felt her hand touch his back. Once, and then he stepped aside, and she walked down the line and finished the job and smiled at everybody, and nobody ever knew. 2 days later, he was summoned. He said he spent the whole walk there working out what he'd do for work afterwards. Reckoned he'd go back to his uncle's yard, fencing, something with his hands. Because he'd let go of a royal's arm during a breach. You don't do that. That's the one thing, whatever else happens, you do not let go. And Adela had him brought into a little room with a bad radiator, and she said, "Corporal Roach, do you know what you did wrong?" And he said, "Everything, ma'am." And she said, "Almost." Then she stood up and put her right hand flat on her own collarbone, fingers spread, palm down, held it. And she said, "That means don't let go." He didn't understand at first. He told me he stood there like a fool. She explained it. She said, "One day it'll happen again. Not a man with a newspaper, something else, something we haven't thought of. And when it does, I will go away again. Not on purpose. I'll just go. And everybody around me will do what they're trained to do, which is get me out, and they'll pull me and shout at me, and they'll be perfectly correct, and it won't help, because when I'm like that, the pulling makes it worse." She said, "What helps is somebody standing still." And she said, "But I can't tell you when it's happening. I can't speak when it's happening. That's what it is." So this, she put her hand on her chest again. "When you see this," she said, "you come, you don't wait for an order, there won't be one. You come and you stand in front of me and you don't let go." And Roach, 24 green, no use to anybody, said the only thing he could think of, which was, "Ma'am, if I do that, they'll have my stripes." And Queen Adela of Tarnwick, who was not queen yet and never expected to be, looked at him and said, "Yes, that's why I'm asking you and not them." He never used it. 29 years. He was on her detail for 6 of them. Then he went to the gate, and he stood on that pavement while she became queen and got married and had a daughter and got ill and died. And in 29 years, he never once saw that hand go up. He said he looked for it every single day. He said that was the job. Nobody knew it was the job. It wasn't on any sheet. But every morning for 29 years, Emlyn Roach stood at Kingsgate and looked at the world, and one small part of his brain was doing nothing else at all, just watching in case. And she never needed him. He said, "And this is the bit that gets me. I had to turn round and pretend to sort the buckets," he said. "I used to think I'd wasted it, Wilf. 29 years of watching for something that never came. Felt like a man keeping an umbrella by the door for a rain that stopped." And then, 3 years after her funeral, on the 3rd Saturday in April, a 9-year-old girl in a blue coat put her right hand flat on her chest in the middle of a stampede. Nobody taught her that. That's what I want you to sit with for a second. Nobody sat that child down and briefed her. There was no protocol, no folder, no palace official saying, "If you're ever in trouble, do this." Her mother taught her. At some point, and we'll never know when, and I've decided I don't want to know. I think it's better as a whole in the story. At some point, a woman who knew she was dying sat on the edge of a bed with a 6-year-old and taught her a hand signal. And told her presumably something like, "There's a man at the gate. He's been there forever. If you're ever frightened and you can't say it, do this and he'll come." 3 years that child carried it. Never used it, never told anyone. 9 years old, sitting on the thing like a stone in her pocket, waiting for a rain that hadn't come. And when it came, she didn't scream, and she didn't run, and she didn't reach for her father. She put her hand on her chest, and she trusted a promise her dead mother had made her, about a man she'd probably never spoken to in her life. And he came. So when that colonel leaned across the table and said, "Sergeant, how did you know?" you can see why he sat there for 20 minutes and said nothing. What was he going to say? "The late Queen and I had an arrangement, sir." There was no record of it. No witness. Adela was dead. The only other person alive who knew was a 9-year-old girl who was, at that moment, under sedation in a room upstairs. He had no proof of anything. He'd left his post. He'd disobeyed a standing order. He'd gone into a civilian crowd with a weapon in his hands during a suspected device incident, which is, I've been told by people who know, about the worst combination of words you can put in a report. There were people that week who wanted him in prison. And there were other people, the ones who'd seen the footage, who wanted him knighted. And in between them, there was a hearing room and a long table, and a man with a scar through his eyebrow sitting very straight with his hands on his knees, refusing to explain himself. For 20 minutes. Until the door opened. I wasn't there. I want to be honest about that because I've heard people tell this bit like they were standing in the corner of the room, and they weren't, and neither was I. I got it from 3 people over about a year, and they didn't know each other, and they all told it the same. That's usually how you know. 20 minutes of silence. Picture it, a long room on the first floor with tall windows and a radiator that clanks. 4 people on one side of a table, the colonel in the middle, a woman from the household on his left, 2 others whose names I never got. Papers in front of them, a jug of water that nobody touched. And on the other side, on a chair with no arms, Sergeant Emlyn Roach in service dress with his hands flat on his knees, looking at a point on the wall about a foot above the colonel's head. They asked him 9 times. Different ways, that's what they do. They come at it from the side, then from underneath, then straight down the middle. Did you see something we didn't? Did you receive a communication? Was there a prior arrangement? Sergeant, we are trying to help you. And he said, no, sir, or I can't say, sir, or nothing at all. The woman from the household, she was the one who lost her temper. Apparently she put both hands flat on the table and said, Sergeant, do you understand that you are throwing your entire life away in this room this morning for the sake of not finishing a sentence? And Roach said, yes, ma'am. And that was the 20th minute. Then the door opened. Nobody had knocked. There was a footman on the other side of it with a face like he'd been asked to swallow a wasp, because he'd tried to stop it happening, and had discovered something that everybody in that building was about to discover over the next few years. Princess Wren was 9 years old, and she was not actually someone you stopped. She came in, pale, properly pale, somebody's cardigan on over her own clothes, sleeves too long. There was a graze down the side of her jaw from where she'd gone against the railings, and a plaster on it, and her plate had been redone by somebody who didn't know how to do plates. The colonel stood up. They all stood up. There's an entire machine of protocol for what happens when a member of the royal family enters a room, and every bit of that machine went off at once. She didn't look at any of them. She walked past the whole table, past the water jug, past 4 extremely senior people who had just got to their feet, and she stopped in front of a chair with a sergeant sitting on it. He'd stood up too, of course he had. She had to look almost straight up to see his face. And she said, and every single person in that room gave me the same words, which is why I believe it. She said, did you tell them? And Roach said, no, ma'am. And she said, good. Then she turned round. She turned round and faced the table, and she took her right hand and she put it flat on her chest, palm down, fingers spread, over the top of a borrowed cardigan. And she held it there. And she said, this is my mother's. She gave it to me and she gave it to him, and she said it belongs to us and nobody else. 9 years old. So I'm going to tell you what it means, she said. And then it won't be secret anymore, and that's a thing I can't undo, and I've thought about it and I'm doing it anyway. Because he won't tell you and you're going to punish him, and I'm not having that. She said, I'm not having that. They said her voice didn't wobble until the last 3 words. So she told them. Everything, the bed, the 6-year-old, the whole thing. She said her mother had been very tired that day and had made her practice it 11 times, which is a detail nobody could have invented, and which is the reason the whole room believed her inside about 4 seconds. 11 times, until a 6-year-old had it in her bones. And she told them what her mother had said afterwards, which was the bit that got out eventually and ended up on tea towels, God help us. There's a man at the gate. He's been there since before you were born. He is not there for the palace. He's there for you. And then Wren said, still with her hand on her chest, still not sitting down, still with everyone standing. He waited 29 years. He never got to use it for her, so he used it for me. And you're asking him how he knew like he did something sneaky. And apparently the colonel, who was, by all accounts, not a soft man, the colonel sat down. Not because he was told to. His legs just did it. They cleared him. I want to be careful because it wasn't as clean as people say. It took 11 weeks. There was a proper investigation, and there had to be, and I understand that now better than I did at the time. Here's what they found in the end. They found he'd left his post. That was true, and he never denied it, and it stayed on the record, and it's on the record today. But they also found, and this is the bit that saved him, they found that between 11:26 and 43 and 11:26 and 52, Sergeant Emlyn Roach had put his body between a 9-year-old girl and a crowd surge that the report described, in that flat way official reports have, as capable of producing fatal compressive injury in a person of the princess's stature. Which means she'd have died. They put it in the appendix, page 400 and something. In among the load calculations and the wind speeds and the diagrams with the little arrows, some engineer had worked out what 4,000 people moving sideways does to a 9-year-old against an iron railing. Nobody's ever printed that page. I've never seen anyone quote it. But it's in there, and the colonel had read it before he ever sat down at that table. And I've always wondered how much of those 20 minutes was him needing Roach to give him a reason he could write down. The scaffold, by the way. Since I know you're wondering, because everyone always is, and because it feels wrong to tell you a story about a bang and never say what came of it. Nobody died. 14 people to hospital, 2 of them serious, a woman with a broken pelvis and a lad of 19 who'd been standing right under the west pillar and got the edge of a board across the back of the skull. He was in for 5 weeks. He came out. He walks with a bit of a list to the left, and he did an interview about it once, and he was funny about it, funnier than I'd have been. The rest of us were cuts and cracks and shock. My knee needed 9 stitches, and it still tells me when it's going to rain, which is a useless superpower in Tarnwick because the answer's always yes. The inquiry took a year and a half and blamed a bracket. A bracket. Some fixing on the second lift that had been specified for one thing and used for another, and had been quietly working itself loose since February while 10,000 people a day walked underneath it taking photographs. 2 companies got fined. Nobody went to prison, there's a plaque. That's it, that's the whole terrible bang that stopped a nation's heart for 4 hours. A bracket and a gust of wind. I've thought about that a lot. The size of the noise versus the size of the cause. It's usually like that, I find. Now, the thing people get wrong. There's a statue. It went up 2 years after, down at the Marley Row end. And it's bronze and it's 10 feet tall and it is, I'm sorry, it's wrong. It's him carrying her, cap on, chin up, striding out, the little girl in his arms with her face turned to the camera. Very heroic, very handsome. Schoolchildren get taken to it. He didn't carry her out. He knelt, he went down on one knee in the middle of a stampede and made a room out of his own back and waited with people falling against him, waited until she decided to put her arms round his neck. He never grabbed her, not once. And his cap was gone. It went at step 4. I've said this to people. They nod and they say, yes, well, it's symbolic, and I want to take them by the lapels. Because the kneeling is the whole thing. Anyone can carry a child. Carrying's easy, it's what you do to someone. Kneeling down in the middle of everything and holding a space open and letting her choose, that's the hard one. That's the one that takes 29 years to learn. They should have made him kneeling, with no cap on and his hair all over the place and his knee about to be ruined for life, which it was, by the way. He never got the full bend back in it. But you can't put that on a plinth, I suppose. Doesn't read from a distance. He came to the cart in July. I'd been back on the corner about 6 weeks by then, on a stool with the knee out straight and a new awning that never sat right. Trade was ridiculous. People came to buy flowers off the flower man from the video, which is not a thing I ever wanted to be, and I'd have to say, no, love, that was 300 yards that way. And they'd buy a bunch anyway out of embarrassment. I made more money that summer than the 4 before it put together, off the back of the worst day of my life. Still don't know what to do with that. Anyway, it was a Tuesday, middle of the afternoon, dead quiet, and I looked up and there he was in a cardigan. A cardigan, Emlyn Roach. I had no idea what to do with my face. 22 years of thanks, Wilf, and now this. He said, all right, Wilf. I said something. God knows what. He looked at the buckets for a bit. Then he said, Fresia's, small one. So I made him a small one. Took me a while with the knee. He waited. Didn't offer to help, which I appreciated more than I can tell you. And then he paid, exact change. Of course he did. And he stood there holding them and didn't leave, and I realized he wanted to say something and couldn't get at it. and so I did the thing you do, which is not look at him. I sorted the buckets. 22 years on a corner teaches you when to look at your own hands. And that's when he told me about Portsmere, and 94, and the room with the bad radiator. The whole thing at my cart, in about 11 minutes, in a voice like gravel in a tin. I asked him one question, just one. I've been glad of it ever since, and I've also thought maybe I shouldn't have. I said, Emlyn, how did you see it? Because that's the bit, isn't it? That's the bit that never made sense to me. 300 feet, 4,000 people, a crowd coming apart, a noise like the end of the world, and every instinct in his body screaming at him to look at the arch. And he looked at a hand. He thought about it for a good while, long enough that I stopped waiting for an answer and went back to the buckets. Then he said, I wasn't looking for a hand, Wilf. I was looking for her. And I said, who, the girl? And he said, no. And then he stood there in a cardigan in the sun with a bunch of freesias in his fist, and his eyes went somewhere, and he said, 29 years I've stood on that gate and looked for a woman putting her hand on her chest. Every day. It's the first thing I do in the morning, and I don't even know I'm doing it anymore. Adela's been dead 3 years, and I've never stopped. He said, so when it happened, I didn't have to see it. I'd been seeing it in my head for 30 years. She just stepped into the shape. He said, I didn't recognize the signal. I recognized her mother. I have never got over that. I don't expect to. He'd kept an umbrella by the door for a rain that stopped. That's what he said to me that day. He'd thought he'd wasted it. 29 years of a man doing a thing nobody knew he was doing, for a promise nobody had written down, made to a woman who was gone. And it turned out he hadn't been keeping the umbrella for her at all. He'd been keeping it for a child who didn't exist yet. He didn't go back on the gate. The knee wouldn't take it, first of all. You can't stand 2-hour details on a knee like that. But it was more than the knee, and everyone knew it, because the whole world had seen his face now, and a Kingsgate guard whose face the whole world knows isn't a guard anymore, he's a thing. Tourists would have queued. So they moved him inside, something with training, I think. Standards is what he called it when I asked. Standards, Wilf wouldn't say more. He still comes past, not often, once, twice a year, always freesias, always small, always exact change. He never says why, I never ask. But I know when Adela's birthday is, same as everybody, and I've done the sums, and I've never once said a word about it. And Wren. Well, you know about Wren. Everyone knows about Wren now. She's 12, she's out and about all the time these days. She does about 40 things a year, which is more than her father ever did, and she's frighteningly good at it. She does the crouching down to eye level thing that her mother did. She does the theatrical stagger under a big bouquet. She's got the smile that's real and the smile that's practiced, and I can still tell them apart from 100 yards, and I'm pleased to report the real one's winning. She's been past my cart twice. The second time, last April, actually, near enough 3 years to the day, she stopped. Whole line stopped, aides bunching up behind her, and this 12-year-old girl looked at my buckets and then at me and said, "You're Mr. Brannan." And I said something intelligent like, "Yes, ma'am," and I nearly went over backwards. And she said, "You lost your cart." I said, "I did, ma'am." And she said, "I'm sorry about that." 12 years old, 14 people in hospital, a scaffold down, her whole world turned over in a third of a second, and she stood on my corner apologizing for my flower cart. I said, "It's only a cart, ma'am. Carts can be got again." And she looked at me for a second with those eyes, and I swear to you, I swear, for about a second and a half, that was Adela standing in front of me, and my arms came up in gooseflesh in the April sun. And she said, "Some things can't." And then she moved on down the line. I've told this story a lot now, more than I should have. It's got polished in places where it shouldn't be polished. That's what happens. You find the words that work and you keep them, and after a few years you're not remembering it anymore, you're remembering the telling of it. So I try. Every so often I make myself go back and find the bits that don't fit nicely. Like the fact that I'd sold a wedding order's worth of freesias by 10 past 10, and I felt guilty about it for a week, and that's what was on my mind that morning. Not history, freesias. Like the man in the yellow jacket and the pram, I still don't know his name. He was faster than any of us, and nobody's ever made a statue of him. Like the way the crowd smelled afterwards. Nobody puts that in. It smelled like brick dust and sweat, and for some reason, cut flowers, thousands of pounds of them trodden into that road for 400 yards, and for about a year after that I couldn't get near a bruised stem without my heart going. Like the fact that Emlyn Roach shouted, and I've never been able to tell you what he shouted because it wasn't a word. That's the true bits, the ragged ones. The ones that don't go anywhere. 9 seconds. I counted them without knowing I was counting. And I've had 3 years on this corner to work out why I did that. Why my brain, of all the things it could have been doing while I was flat on my back with my knee opening up, decided to keep a tally. I think it's because I knew. Not what I was seeing. I didn't know about Portsmere or the radiator or the 11 times. I didn't know any of it. But I knew that a man who had not moved in 30 years had moved, and that whatever made him move must have been enormous, and that I had better count, because someone was going to ask me one day, and I'd want to be able to say. So here it is, here's my saying. People come to my corner every day to see the palace. They stand where I'm standing, and they take a photograph of a building. And they all walk past the gate on their way, past a young man or woman in a red tunic standing perfectly still, and half of them pull a face, and 1 in 50 tries to make them laugh, and every single one of them thinks the same thing. Why do they stand like that? What are they even doing? I know now. They're not standing there. That's not what it is. They're waiting, every one of them. Waiting for a thing that will almost certainly never come, for years, for decades, in the rain, while people pull faces at them, waiting for one moment they hope to God they never see. And nearly all of them will do the whole thing and go home, and never be needed once. That's not a waste, I thought it was. Emlyn thought it was, and he was the one doing it. It isn't. Because the only reason a 9-year-old girl could put her hand on her chest in the middle of the worst thing that ever happened on this street, the only reason that meant anything at all, was that somebody had spent 29 years standing in the cold, being no use to anybody, watching for it. You don't get the 9 seconds without the 29 years. Nobody ever tells you that bit. There's no statue of a man standing still. Anyway, I'm still here, knee and all. New cart, same corner. Tulips in April, and they still open too early in the van, and they're still no good to anybody, and I still buy them. And every morning at about 7 I set up, and the guard comes out, and whoever it is takes their post, and they go still. And I always say the same thing under my breath, every day, 3 years now. I say, all right, I see you. Because somebody should.